Hi folks, we are currently at part 2 of Changing the World. We're going to be talking about resistance and social movements particularly. So we spoke a little bit about political power and power more broadly, and as Foucault and others have theorised, if power isn't necessarily a top-down phenomenon, then there must be resistance to different types of power from different directions. Today I'm going to be talking about very specific types of resistance, but it's good to start off with an understanding that the power that we spoke about outside of formal political apparatuses, such as in the family, can also be met with different types of resistances. We'll be talking about how resistance operates within the state and how it pertains to social movements, but it's good to keep in mind that when we're talking about resistance, it has a lot of different forms and functions. I think what's most closely associated when we think of the word resistance is this formal resistance movement. We think of rebels and social justice warriors and activists and protesters, and all of that is very true. If we're talking about man's formal spheres of power, as we did at the beginning, the economic, the political, the military, and the ideological, disruptive power is the type of power that is accessible to those without access to those other types of formal types of power. Often the people that are associated with those spheres, those formal spheres of power, don't need to resort to disruptive tactics to achieve their ends or to make use of themselves in that structure. So when we're talking about disruptive power, that again can take many forms, but more formally it is what the images that we think of when we think of resistance, the rebels, the activists, the social justice warriors. There's a number of tactics and repertoires that disruptive power can take, from the individual to the collective, and from the more disruptive to the less disruptive. And that sort of operates a bit on a spectrum as well. Almost exclusively, disruptive power is aimed at the power elite. It is the type of power that is sort of a bit removed from those formal types of power that man was theorising about, because it needs to intrude on those spheres of power in some way. Often the shape that the disruptive power takes, the repertoires that are chosen and the tactics that are used, are tailored to try to maximise their leverage to disrupt either the political, the economic, or the ideological spheres, not necessarily the military sphere, because as you can imagine, you're sort of going into the world of armed resistance. It's worthwhile commenting though that when we're talking about resistance and when we're talking about formal avenues of disruption, then they can become violent. And often, when the state is at its weakest, those armed revolts, those violent revolts, can become more successful, and that tactic, that repertoire, can be the means by which violence is leveraged against a military sphere, against a political sphere, to achieve their objectives. There's quite a lot of academic discussion, as you can probably imagine, about what formulates social revolt and what is political revolution. And it's probably most helpful to think of that as a kind of continuation of what we've been talking about, which is formal resistance to power, and often using disruptive tactics to address that power. As you can see from the image there, Martin Luther King, back in the 50s and 60s, spoke very eloquently about their moral duty to resist unjust laws, and it was it's been an interesting sphere. It's been an interesting example to study academically, because within the civil rights movement, you had a number of different types of organisations trying to adopt different tactics to achieve the same ends. And so there was a plurality within the civil rights movement in the US about what was appropriate, what types of tactics were appropriate to achieve justice as they saw it. So as I've outlined, when we're talking about resistance to power more broadly, we're talking about the embodied acts that we do as humans, often collectively, forcefully trying to stop something from occurring, or forcing our position and our views to be heard in a formal power structure. But when we're talking about political change and angling to disrupt the formal powers, political powers, military powers, and so on, this can almost start with sort of everyday acts of resistance, the types of activities that most people have access to, that are, if not on the very low end of disruption, then they're not necessarily disruptive at all. We're talking about a different type of resistance. We're talking about something that has a lot more cultural value, particularly when we're talking about social movements and being inside a social movements and identity, than we do disruptive power to achieve an end. Everyday acts of resistance can be as simple as purchasing a product that you wish to support, and avoiding purchasing those products that you do not wish to support for whatever reason that may be. Ideological reasons predominantly, as an act of boycotting to generally, use your wallet, the power of the dollar, as a sort of voting mechanism, is how it's been likened to in the past. Petitions are another really good example of this sort of non-disruptive act of resistance. By signing your name, you are formalising your position in opposition to something. You're formalising your position as part of usually a collective or an organised social movement for change. But everyday acts of resistance often take the form of memes and making music clips and being creative and sending a very overtly political message through the form of cultural appropriation or similar. When we're talking about particularly boycotting and boycotting, there are implications to who can participate in this. Even though the bar is very low to participation and access to these types of everyday resistance is quite low, there are these, there's a reproduction of the inequalities that already exist in society, and one of those is class. Boycotting and boycotting particularly is all fine and well if you have the money to purchase those things that you would like to support, and withhold your money from purchasing the things that you don't. It's often in a discretionary spending way. The rest of your non-discretionary spending, going to the supermarket for your fruit and veggies, is not going to change. The act of boycotting and boycotting is usually open to those with a disposable income that would ordinarily be purchasing a product from a company that they wish to support or otherwise. People's knowledge of why people would or would not boycott, people's understanding of the cultural conversations and discourses that are happening, that others are making music clips and memes about, may be very dependent on your level of education and your engagement, your political engagement with what's happening in your society. And if you're, if you're struggling to put food on the table and pay your rent, those things are going to pass you by. Class is often a barrier to inclusion in resistance movements because of what's known as structural availability, particularly when disruptive tactics are used in more formal settings, such as the repertoires and the tactics of marching, demonstrating, blocking roads, that sort of thing. You've got to make yourself available to be there in person, to form a chain that's going to block a road, or you're going to be there to listen to a speech and to march and to show your solidarity, which takes time. You need to take time out of your day. You need to get to the venue and back from the venue. And this is called a structural availability. Those people that need to spend that time working are often not going to engage in that type of behaviour. There's also cultural implications in these everyday acts of resistance. Often they are around access via the language. If English isn't your first language living in Australia, often the nuances of the messaging that can be put out with, not just even the cultural material, but the petitions and whatnot, may make you think twice about how much you understand the movement's causes and aims and what your participation is going to contribute to it. And as we said, when we're talking about man's formal spheres of power, one of those is the military, and the acts of resistance have often, and history attests to this, resulted in armed insurrection. So a social revolt is backed up by arms and is backed up by a number of people that are willing to contribute in that way, using those tools. I think most definitively the age of revolutions, from the American and then the French particularly, we see a social revolt escalating as a series of steps into a more and more organised military response to a weakened state. This is replicated throughout history. The 1830s, particularly 1848, saw social revolts, popular uprisings that were then backed by militias and armed insurrectionaries, becomes the means by which people want to take over the state and effect political revolution. Little bit differently, but certainly in the very recent memory, is the Arab Spring uprising. Again, this sort of uprising that started with one or two people in Tunisia in 2010, fomenting a popular anger that the resistance initially took the forms of street demonstrations, sit-ins, marches particularly, before the political demands became backed up by the same people that were marching and that were participating, arming themselves and effectively coercing the people that were sent to respond to them, the military, effectively coercing the military message so that they overthrew the state apparatus. It was very quickly established in another guise in almost all forms from the Arab uprising, but it does happen. This social revolt very quickly turns into an armed political revolution. So when we're talking about social movements particularly, there's a very large body of academic literature that studies social movements, and it's somewhat formalised. But the best understanding that we have sort of follows the cycle that you can see on the screen here. This is from Bloomer. He was theorising in the late 60s, early 70s particularly, as were others, Tilly, etc. And he recognised that there were stages of social movement generation, and there is an emergence where there's a tension there in society. People are conscious of their everyday living experience being not as it should be, or being pressured by another force. Often it's a number of forces, so it can be the cost of living versus an oppressive state, or it can be as simple as what we've seen recently as far as social movements is concerned. The perceived injustice of one section of society and how they're treated by the state. So there's tension that exists in society. It's sitting just below the surface. We often hear of these sort of verbs like simmering and roiling and teeming. There's an antagonism there that is born of experience, personal experience. And often what happens is that the people who feel this way find each other at a particular time or after a particular event, and it coalesces. People realise their personal issue is now a public problem, or vice versa, and they find each other. They recognise how widespread their own feelings and their own experiences are, and they come together with the objective of overcoming it. They make usually concrete demands at this stage. Here's the problem, here's the solution as we perceive it, and they are starting to talk about the tactics and repertoires that they're going to collectively use to achieve these ends. Often with most of the social movements that we see, this coalescence usually operates in a networked environment. We'll get to that in the next section, but people are finding themselves, and they're kind of condensing their movement goals very quickly, and often the coalescence occurs rapidly and is backed up by marches and action very rapidly before it starts to take on the shape of an organisation that most people would recognise. It usually has a name. It usually operates on a membership basis. People become members of the organisation. There's a structure there. They often think about how they're going to lead themselves. And this is called a bureaucratic. This is a bureaucratisation of what was just a coalescence of individuals acting collectively. At this stage, it's important to realise that this is just a word. Bureaucratisation is just a word for a professionalisation and more formal structures to what is often an informal beast. And some social movements make a very deliberate choice not to go down this path. Organisations such as the Gilets jaunes in France, the Yellow Vests, or Occupy, have made very definite choices not to bureaucratise, not to have any type of formal structure, to remain flat managerially, to remain leaderless. In a bid to be more inclusive to people that want to become a part of their movement without formally having to say that they're a part of that movement. The downside is, of course, that they can fail to be recognised, they can be easily dismissed, particularly by the state, and we're talking about politicians and commentators, and they can fail to enter into negotiations, which is often, particularly in our Western world, required now. Negotiation is often required now to hold a march, and with any people coming together in the street being an unauthorised assembly and therefore immediately dismissed by police, for example. After bureaucratisation, often organisations sit in that orbit. They've got their structure, they've got their membership, they start taking on donations, they maintain a stability. But as is often the case, there is a decline. Even for large bureaucratic organisations that represent social movements, there can be a decline, not just in the membership and disillusion of the structures, but social movements that have not bureaucratised can often just sort of fall away. People can stop participating, people can move on to something else. And I mean, it's unusual to hear about it, but their demands can be met. Some social movements are very localised and they're very specific, and so their goals can be addressed, and their local concerns can be taken care of, and there's no need for that organisation anymore. There's no need for the push anymore. Particularly historically, you can see things like the Sydney Harbour foreshore committees of the turn of the 20th century were instrumental in carving out big plots of land that would otherwise be privatised for public use. And they were granted that in a number of pretty famous cases, and having achieved their aims, there's no need for those committees, there's no need for those social movements anymore. Often what happens is you see a merging and a blending. People from a social movement who share interests find each other, and they've also got other interests. Their protesting repertoires are useful in another sphere, and they can move on. This discussion about new social movements, as you can see, I have indicated, it's almost a bit of a misnomer now. Habermas particularly, Giddens a little later, made a distinction in social movements, in the Western world particularly, around the 70s and pretty much from the 60s through to the late 70s, where traditionally labour unions particularly personified a type of social movement that was almost exclusively focused on material gains. They were protecting the right of their working rights, they were protecting the rights of their members, they needed to have safety issues addressed in their workplaces, they fought for better pay and conditions. But before even that, I mean, as old as the unions are, you had agitation for universal suffrage. There was a demand for more rights in this liberalised world. But the distinction that they made between this new part was that the emancipatory social movements of the past, the unions, the suffragette movement, took on more cultural and abstract ideas, such as the protection of the environment, such as their right to be fighting for inclusion, fighting for recognition. You see this a lot from Stonewall on, from the LGBTIQ social movements. A lot of that was based on the turn, I guess, that feminism had taken in the 60s about their rights in society, not just in the workplace, but the rights for female recognition, as well as these material concerns of equal pay and so on. So this distinction that's made between the old and the new social movements is often around materiality. It also has, it's a little hard to say if it has, what sort of impacts it has, but tactics are usually dictated too by the types of goals and social movement activities that want to be conducted. There's not an opportunity for LGBTIQ protesters to be locked out of a workplace and to form a picket line, for example. The tactics can be modified slightly, but they need a specific place. It's then located in a geography. So The tactics can often be modified, but there is sometimes quite a sharp distinction between the emancipatory social movements and these so-called new social movements. Often new social movements are particularly associated with awareness raising or bringing popular attention to something. Popularising generally is often one of their stated goals. And it's also one of their attributes. You see a diverse array of causes, being freed of having a location to protest in, or rights to protest for in a material sense, means that it can become much more localised and it can become much broader. You can go for popular appeal via petitions and awareness raising on social media, for example, or you can protest something very locally. You can rally around your neighbourhood park, for example. There are a number of causes that can be adopted in new social movements, almost exclusively associated with human rights of one kind or another. They tend to be quite creative and playful, particularly when people are going for a broader appeal, rather than a local action that they want to have taken place. And it's often, as I mentioned, with sort of leaderless organisations, there is an internal pluralism to a lot of these social movements. There is often a lot of contestation inside these social movements about the tactics that they should employ to the same ends. And there can be often different parts of the social movement pulling in different directions. Some people want to focus on one concrete goal very specifically, others want to do an awareness raising about a whole range of issues, and it can pull in different directions at different times, and that needs to be managed. Okay, I might leave it there. Thanks so much.